"Open up, I won't stop until my child is in your womb." 70-year-old rancher and his giant girlfriend. The sun rose slowly over the wide, dry plains of Texas, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The wind carried the smell of earth and grass, mixed with the faint scent of horses and cattle. In the middle of this vast land stood an old ranch, large and worn but full of life. Its fences were weathered and bent in some places, and the barn leaned slightly to one side. But to Caleb Harper, the 70-year-old owner, it was perfect. Every inch of that land had a memory. Every fence post, every tree, every dusty path held a story of years gone by. Caleb was not a man who liked company. He had lived alone for many years, his wife gone for decades, and his children grown and scattered across the country. Most days he woke with the sun, tended to his cattle, fixed fences, and walked the fields to make sure everything was in order. The ranch had been his life, his responsibility, and his pride. Yet as much as he loved it, there was a loneliness that clung to him like the dust on his boots. One morning, as he sipped his coffee on the porch, Caleb noticed a strange shadow at the edge of his field. Squinting, he saw a figure walking steadily toward the house. It was not a man, nor was it an ordinary woman. The figure was unusually tall, towering even above his own broad shoulders. Her steps were confident, and she moved with a grace that made her seem larger than life. Caleb rubbed his eyes, unsure if the early morning light was playing tricks on him. But when he looked again, she was still there, walking straight toward him, her shadow stretching long across the grass. "Hello," Caleb called out, his voice rough from years of talking to nothing but animals. "Can I help you?" Most people wanted money, fame, or the excitement of the open land. Few were willing to stay for long, especially on a ranch like his, which demanded long hours, hard work, and patience. But there was something in Margaret's eyes, a calm determination, a quiet strength, that made him pause. "You don't mind my size, do you?" she asked, almost apologetically, though her height was striking. She was easily over 6.5 feet tall, with broad shoulders and long, strong limbs. Most people would have been intimidated, but Caleb was not most people. He had seen all kinds of people in his life, and he knew that size did not always equal strength of character. "I mind nothing that works hard and can handle a shovel," Caleb said with a half-smile. "You're welcome here if you can do the work." She had the look of someone who had lived her whole life navigating a world made for smaller people. Over the next few weeks, Margaret settled into life on the ranch. She was strong and capable, lifting bales of hay and fixing broken fences with ease. The cattle seemed to recognize her presence, grazing calmly as she walked among them. Caleb watched her work, sometimes from a distance, sometimes from beside her, offering advice or sharing stories about the ranch. They rarely spoke of themselves, but there was a growing understanding between them, a silent respect that grew out of shared labor and the quiet hours under the sun. At night, after the work was done, they would sit on the porch, looking out over the fields. Margaret would talk about her past life in the city, the challenges of being different, of being seen as other. She spoke of the loneliness she had felt, the struggle to find a place where she belonged. Caleb listened quietly, occasionally sharing a story from his own life, a lost love, a broken fence, a stubborn cow that refused to be herded. Slowly, the silence between them became comfortable, a space where words were not always necessary. Caleb began to notice small things. Margaret had a laugh that could carry across the field, light and infectious. She had a habit of humming softly while working, a tune that made the cattle pause and tilt their heads as if listening. She was precise, careful, yet capable of quick, decisive action when needed. It was clear that she was not just strong but intelligent and thoughtful, a combination that Caleb found rare. One afternoon, a storm rolled in from the west. Dark clouds gathered and the wind picked up, whipping the grass into waves. Caleb and Margaret hurried to secure the animals and cover the hay. The rain came down in sheets, cold and relentless. They worked side by side, shouting instructions over the roar of the storm. When the last animal was safe and the barn doors locked, they stood drenched, panting, and laughing at the sheer chaos of it all. "Not many could handle a storm like that," Caleb said, shaking his head. "You're stronger than you look." He realized that Margaret had brought something into his life that he hadn't expected: energy, laughter, and a reminder that life could still surprise him. Over the following months, they worked together to repair old buildings, expand pastures, and care for the animals. Caleb taught Margaret about the rhythms of the land, the behavior of the cattle, and the nuances of ranch life that could only come with decades of experience. In turn, Margaret shared new ideas and perspectives, suggesting ways to make tasks easier, more efficient, or even safer. They became a team, each relying on the other in ways that neither had anticipated. The neighbors began to notice the unusual pair. Margaret's height and presence were impossible to ignore, and Caleb's advanced age made their partnership all the more remarkable. Some were curious, others skeptical, but most simply shook their heads and continued with their own lives. Caleb and Margaret paid little attention to gossip. They had their work, their land, and their growing friendship, which was enough. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in fiery reds and purples, Caleb found himself thinking about the future. He was 70 years old and much of his life had already passed. Yet, with Margaret at his side, the ranch felt alive again. He realized that it was not just the land that mattered, but the connections formed on it, the trust, the respect, and the companionship that made every day meaningful. Margaret, too, had begun to see the ranch as more than just a place of work. It was a home, a space where she was valued, and where her differences were celebrated rather than criticized. She had grown to care for Caleb, not just as a partner in labor, but as a friend and mentor, someone whose wisdom and kindness had changed her perspective on life. Life on the ranch continued, each day bringing new challenges and small victories. The cattle were healthy, the fences were strong, and the land was thriving. Caleb and Margaret moved through their days with a rhythm that was both comforting and invigorating, a dance of shared effort and mutual respect. They learned from each other, laughed with each other, and slowly built a bond that neither had expected but both welcomed wholeheartedly. As the first part of their story came to a close, the ranch stood as a symbol of resilience, companionship, and the surprising ways life could bring two unlikely people together. Caleb looked at Margaret one evening as she tended to the animals, her tall figure silhouetted against the golden light of the setting sun. He realized that, despite the years he had lived alone, he was no longer lonely. And Margaret, watching him repair a fence with careful precision, felt a sense of belonging she had never known before. The story of the old rancher and his giant companion was just beginning, and neither of them knew what the future held. But they both understood one thing clearly: life, with all its challenges and surprises, was better shared. Spring had come to the Harper Ranch, and with it, a freshness that seemed to awaken everything. The grass was greener, the flowers along the fence lines were blooming, and the air carried the sweet scent of new beginnings. Caleb Harper, 70 years old and still strong in mind and body, moved through his fields with a steady pace. Margaret followed closely behind, her tall frame easily navigating the uneven ground. They worked in harmony, like two parts of a well-oiled machine, each knowing what the other would do before it happened. The ranch had grown busier in the past months. Margaret had suggested a better layout for the cattle pens, making it easier to feed and move the animals. Caleb had resisted at first, stubborn as he was, but when he saw how smoothly the cattle moved under the new system, he admitted that she was right. "You have a way of thinking differently, Margaret," he said one morning, wiping sweat from his brow. "Sometimes it takes a fresh eye to see what I've missed for years. And sometimes it takes experience to know when not to change something that works," she replied. They laughed together, the sound carrying across the fields, mixing with the calls of the birds and the lowing of the cattle. One morning, as they were moving the cows to a new pasture, Caleb noticed something unusual near the edge of the field. A small group of cattle had wandered close to the creek, and one young calf was struggling in the water. The current was gentle, but it was enough to unbalance the calf, and it was clearly panicking. Without hesitation, Margaret stepped forward. Her long strides carried her quickly to the calf, and with careful hands she guided it back to solid ground. Caleb watched, impressed by her courage and calm. "You're quick to act," he said, shaking his head in admiration. "I've had to be," Margaret replied, brushing mud from her boots. Life doesn't wait for anyone, and you can't afford to stand still when someone or something needs help. As the days grew warmer, Caleb and Margaret worked on more than just the cattle. The old barn, which had stood for decades, was beginning to show signs of age. Some of the beams were weakened by time, and the roof leaked whenever it rained. Caleb had planned to fix it himself, but Margaret had convinced him to tackle it together. They spent long afternoons on the roof, hammering new boards into place and patching the old leaks. Margaret's height and strength made some tasks easier, and her careful attention to detail prevented mistakes that Caleb might have overlooked. As they worked side by side, they shared stories from their pasts. Caleb told tales of his younger days on the ranch, of cattle drives that had taken weeks, and of storms that had threatened to wash everything away. Margaret spoke of the city where she had grown up, of struggles to fit in, and of her dreams of finding a place where she could be herself. One evening, after the sun had dipped below the horizon, they sat on the barn steps, exhausted but satisfied. The barn looked stronger, safer, and more welcoming. Caleb poured 2 mugs of steaming coffee and handed one to Margaret. "You've made a difference here," he said quietly. "Not just with your work, but with your presence. This place feels alive again. There's a sense of peace here, even in the hard work." One afternoon, a problem arose that tested their teamwork in a new way. A wildfire had started in the distant hills, and the wind was carrying smoke across the plains. Caleb saw the danger immediately. The fire could reach the ranch if it was not contained quickly. He called Margaret, and together they prepared to protect the property. They gathered hoses, buckets, and shovels, and began creating a firebreak around the barn and pastures. The air was thick with smoke, and the heat of the sun added to the tension. Margaret worked tirelessly, her strength and stamina helping to move heavy equipment and clear dry brush. Caleb coordinated the efforts, shouting instructions over the roar of the wind and crackle of distant flames. For hours they labored, their bodies aching, sweat and soot covering them from head to toe. Yet they did not stop, because they knew that stopping could mean disaster. When the fire finally moved past the ranch without causing serious damage, they collapsed under the shade of an old oak tree, breathing heavily. Caleb looked at Margaret, admiration and gratitude shining in his eyes. "I don't know what I would have done without you," he said. Margaret smiled, her face streaked with dirt and sweat. "We make a good team," she replied simply. Life on the ranch continued to bring new challenges. A sudden spring storm caused part of the fence to collapse, and a neighbor's horse wandered onto their land, creating chaos among the cattle. Margaret and Caleb tackled each problem with patience and determination, solving each issue through teamwork and mutual respect. Caleb found that having Margaret by his side made him feel younger, stronger, and more capable than he had in years. He realized that companionship was about more than just presence. It was about shared effort, trust, and understanding. Despite the hard work, they also found moments of simple joy. They would walk along the creek at sunset, watching the water glint in gold and red. They would sit on the porch in the evenings, listening to the quiet hum of the land as the stars appeared one by one. They shared laughter over small accidents, Margaret tripping over a bucket, Caleb spilling coffee, and quiet conversation about the beauty of the world around them. Neighbors and visitors began to notice the unusual pair. Margaret's height and energy, combined with Caleb's age and experience, made them a topic of conversation. People admired their hard work and the way they supported each other. Some were curious about their friendship, while others simply nodded in respect, recognizing the strength of their bond. Caleb paid little attention to gossip. He had learned long ago that what mattered most was the integrity of one's own life, not the opinions of others. Margaret, too, began to feel a deep sense of belonging. She was no longer an outsider, no longer a stranger walking into unknown territory. The ranch had become a home, a place where she was valued and respected. She learned the rhythms of the land, the needs of the animals, and the patience required to live in harmony with nature. In turn, she shared her own skills and knowledge, making life on the ranch smoother and more efficient. One day, while repairing a section of fence near the creek, they discovered signs of erosion that threatened the land. The bank was weakening, and if not addressed, it could collapse and wash part of the pasture away. Caleb frowned, realizing the seriousness of the situation. "We'll need to act fast," he said. Margaret nodded, already planning how to stabilize the soil and reinforce the area. They worked together for days, hauling rocks, planting grass, and building small barriers to protect the land. The work was exhausting, but they persisted, motivated by their shared goal of preserving the ranch. As they labored side by side, their friendship deepened further. Caleb admired Margaret's resilience, and Margaret respected Caleb's wisdom and experience. Together, they made a formidable team. Through these experiences, they both grew in ways they hadn't expected. Caleb learned to embrace new ideas and adapt to changes more readily, inspired by Margaret's fresh perspective. Margaret gained a sense of confidence and purpose, knowing that her contributions were valued and that she could make a tangible difference. Their bond became a source of strength, helping them face challenges with courage and determination. Even in quiet moments, their connection was evident. They shared meals on the porch, watched the sun set behind the hills, and discussed plans for the future of the ranch. Caleb spoke of long-term improvements, like planting new trees and expanding pastures, while Margaret suggested ways to conserve water and protect the soil. Their conversations were full of ideas, respect, and mutual encouragement, reflecting the deep trust they had developed. As part 2 of their story came to a close, the ranch had transformed. The land was healthier, the animals were thriving, and the old barn stood strong against the elements. More importantly, Caleb and Margaret had formed a bond that would carry them through any challenge. They had discovered the power of teamwork, trust, and genuine friendship. Caleb looked at Margaret one evening, her tall figure framed by the golden light of sunset, and felt a sense of gratitude he had not known in years. Margaret, watching Caleb as he repaired a fence with careful precision, felt a sense of purpose and belonging she had never experienced before. The ranch had become more than a place of work. It was a shared life, full of meaning, respect, and hope for the future. The story of the old rancher and his giant companion was far from over. New challenges awaited them, and new adventures would test their skills and their bond. But one thing was certain. Together, they could face whatever came their way, and their lives would continue to grow richer with each passing day. Summer had arrived at the Harper Ranch, bringing with it long days and warm nights. The sun rose early, casting golden light over the fields, and set late, painting the sky with brilliant reds and purples. Caleb Harper, 70 years old but still strong and active, moved through the land with a steady determination. Margaret, his tall and capable companion, followed him closely, her presence both comforting and inspiring. The ranch was thriving, and so were the two people who cared for it so deeply. The heat of summer made the work more difficult. The cattle needed more water, the fields required constant attention, and the barn demanded repairs to withstand the intense sun and occasional storms. Caleb and Margaret had settled into a rhythm, each knowing what the other needed before they even asked. Their teamwork was seamless, and the ranch had never been in better condition. One morning, as they were checking the pastures, Caleb noticed a strange set of footprints near the creek. They were fresh, and the soil showed signs of disturbance. Caleb frowned, knowing that predators sometimes came near the water during the summer. "Looks like we have visitors," he said, pointing to the prints. Margaret knelt to examine them, her long fingers tracing the shapes in the dirt. "It's not a large animal," she said thoughtfully. "Maybe a coyote or a fox, but we should keep an eye on the herd." Over the next few days, they worked together to construct the pens, using sturdy wood and careful design to keep the young animals safe. As the days passed, the ranch faced other challenges. A sudden heat wave caused the creek to dry up in places, forcing Caleb and Margaret to find new ways to provide water for the cattle. They dug additional troughs, rerouted small streams, and even transported water from other parts of the property. The work was exhausting, but neither complained. They knew the importance of keeping the herd healthy and safe. One afternoon, while repairing a fence near the western pasture, they noticed smoke rising in the distance. It was not the familiar wildfire from earlier in the year, but a smaller fire, likely caused by the dry heat and wind. Caleb immediately grabbed his radio and contacted the local fire department, while Margaret organized buckets and hoses to create a temporary barrier. The fire was stubborn, moving quickly toward the dry grasslands. Caleb and Margaret worked tirelessly, dousing flames and clearing brush to prevent the fire from reaching the barn and pastures. Their movements were synchronized, each anticipating the other's actions. The intensity of the work left them soaked in sweat, their clothes stained with soot and dirt. Yet they continued without pause, driven by the need to protect the ranch. When the fire was finally contained, they collapsed under the shade of a large oak tree, breathing heavily. Caleb looked at Margaret, admiration clear in his eyes. "You never stop, do you?" he asked with a tired smile. Margaret laughed, shaking her head. "Not when there's work to be done." "And besides," she added, glancing around at the ranch they had saved, "this is worth it." One evening, after a particularly long day of repairs and tending to the cattle, they sat on the porch, watching the sun set over the hills. Caleb poured 2 mugs of tea and handed one to Margaret. "You know," he said quietly, "I never thought I'd find someone who understands this life the way you do. I've spent so many years alone, thinking I was meant to be that way. But you make it feel different." Caleb spoke of planting an orchard, expanding the pastures, and improving the water system. Margaret suggested ways to conserve resources, plant native vegetation, and create safe habitats for wildlife. Their ideas blended experience with innovation, creating a vision for the ranch that was both practical and forward-looking. One morning, a letter arrived in the mail. It was from Caleb's youngest son, David, who had not visited the ranch in many years. He wrote that he was coming to see the property and reconnect with his father. Caleb felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness. He hadn't seen David in over a decade, and he wasn't sure how the reunion would go. Margaret noticed his unease and placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You'll be fine," she said. "Just be yourself. He'll see why this place and why you are special." He saw the respect and trust they shared, and he understood that his father had found someone who had become essential to the life he loved. The visit was filled with stories, laughter, and reflection. David helped with chores, repaired some of the older fencing, and even spent a night sleeping in the barn, experiencing the rhythm of ranch life firsthand. Caleb felt proud, not just of the ranch, but of the connection he had rebuilt with his son. Margaret, too, felt welcomed, as David recognized her contributions and the positive influence she had on his father. Summer continued, bringing both challenges and rewards. A sudden storm caused a small flood near the creek, washing away part of the newly repaired fence. Caleb and Margaret worked together to rebuild it, learning from past mistakes and improving the structure to withstand future floods. They also discovered a family of foxes living near the creek, and Margaret suggested creating a small protected area for them, balancing the needs of the wildlife with the safety of the cattle. Through these experiences, Caleb and Margaret learned that life on the ranch was never static. Each day brought new problems, but also new opportunities for growth, creativity, and collaboration. They discovered that working together was not just about completing tasks, but about learning from each other, supporting each other, and finding joy in the shared effort. Even in quiet moments, their friendship flourished. They would walk along the creek in the early morning, watching the water reflect the rising sun. They would sit on the porch in the evenings, sipping tea and sharing memories from their pasts. Caleb spoke of his youth, the early days of the ranch, and the lessons he had learned from a life spent outdoors. Margaret shared her experiences from the city, the challenges she had faced, and the dreams that had guided her journey. Neighbors continued to notice the unusual pair. Margaret's height and presence, combined with Caleb's age and experience, made them a topic of conversation in the small town nearby. People admired their hard work, their resilience, and the way they cared for the land and animals. Some were curious about their friendship, while others simply nodded in respect, recognizing the strength of their bond. Caleb and Margaret paid little attention to gossip, knowing that their connection and their work were what truly mattered. One particularly hot afternoon, they discovered a section of the pasture that had been damaged by drought. The soil was dry and cracked, and the grass struggled to grow. Caleb looked at the land with concern. "This is going to take time," he said. "We'll need to bring in water, plant new seeds, and be patient. It will be better than before when we're done." Caleb felt a deep sense of satisfaction, knowing that their hard work was paying off. As part 3 of their story drew to a close, the Harper Ranch had become a place of strength, resilience, and hope. Caleb and Margaret had faced challenges that tested their skills, endurance, and patience, but they had overcome them together. Their bond had grown stronger, rooted in trust, respect, and shared purpose. Caleb looked at Margaret one evening, her tall silhouette framed by the golden sunset, and felt gratitude for the unexpected friendship that had entered his life. Margaret, watching Caleb repair a section of fence with care and precision, felt a sense of belonging and purpose she had never experienced before. The ranch was more than just land and animals. It was a living testament to hard work, determination, and the power of companionship. And as summer days continued to pass, Caleb and Margaret knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, stronger for the bond they had built. The Harper Ranch had settled into a comfortable rhythm as summer deepened. The mornings were filled with the sounds of birds and the low hum of cattle grazing. Caleb Harper, 70 years old and full of quiet strength, moved through the ranch with steady purpose, while Margaret, tall and capable, followed closely, her presence both reassuring and inspiring. Life had grown busy but fulfilling, and the bond between the two had strengthened with each passing day. One morning, as the sun rose over the horizon, casting a warm golden light across the fields, Caleb noticed unusual tracks along the edge of the western pasture. He squinted, recognizing them as footprints, but they were not from any animal he knew. Margaret knelt to examine them, tracing the prints carefully in the soft soil. "These aren't normal," she said thoughtfully. "Someone has been walking through here, but they left no other signs. Maybe just passing by." Margaret suggested setting up small observation points and using binoculars to monitor the distant areas. Caleb agreed, impressed by her foresight. Over the next few days, they continued their watch, but no intruders appeared. It seemed the footprints were a one-time visit, leaving both of them curious but relieved. Life on the ranch was not without other challenges. The summer heat was intense, causing the soil to dry and the grass to wither in some areas. Caleb and Margaret worked tirelessly, moving water troughs, planting drought-resistant grass, and ensuring the cattle had plenty to eat and drink. They learned to anticipate problems before they arose, using experience and observation to keep the ranch in excellent condition. One afternoon, a new challenge arrived in the form of a mechanical problem. The old tractor, which Caleb had relied on for years, refused to start. Without it, moving supplies and equipment would take much longer, and certain tasks would become more difficult. Margaret suggested checking the fuel and battery first, and together they discovered a faulty connection. With careful adjustments and some repairs, they managed to get the tractor running again. Caleb shook his head in admiration. "You have a way of solving problems I've forgotten about," he said, smiling. Margaret laughed, brushing grease from her hands. "Experience helps, but thinking differently sometimes works even better." Caleb shared stories from his youth, of long cattle drives and harsh winters, while Margaret spoke of her experiences in the city and the challenges she had faced there. Through these conversations, they learned more about each other, deepening the respect and trust that had grown between them. One day, a neighboring rancher came by with a request. Heavy rains had damaged part of his property, and he asked for Caleb and Margaret's help in repairing the fences and clearing debris. Caleb hesitated at first, concerned about the workload, but Margaret encouraged him. "It's good for the community," she said, "and we can handle it together." Caleb was reminded that ranch life was not only about caring for his own land, but also about supporting others when needed. Margaret, too, appreciated the opportunity to help and felt proud of the work they accomplished. Back at the Harper Ranch, they faced another challenge. The summer heat had brought a sudden infestation of insects that threatened the crops and grass. Margaret suggested using natural repellents and creating barriers to protect the land. Caleb helped implement the plan, and together they monitored the situation daily. Their combined efforts gradually reduced the problem, and the land began to thrive once more. Amidst the work, moments of leisure became more important. One evening, after a long day, they sat by the creek, letting their feet dip into the cool water. Caleb picked up smooth stones and skipped them across the surface, while Margaret watched with amusement. "You've got a good arm," she said, smiling. Caleb chuckled. "It's been a long time since I did this. Guess some skills never leave you." One particularly hot afternoon, a small calf became sick. Its breathing was labored, and it showed signs of distress. Caleb and Margaret worked together to care for it, keeping it hydrated and monitoring its condition. Margaret suggested using a natural remedy from a book she had brought, and Caleb carefully administered it while following her instructions. After several tense hours, the calf began to recover, its breathing easing and strength returning. Caleb felt a wave of relief and gratitude. "You saved it," he said quietly, looking at Margaret with admiration. Margaret smiled. "We saved it together." They learned that ranch life was not just about hard work. It was about understanding, compassion, and the willingness to act when needed. Neighbors continued to visit, bringing news of the community and seeking advice from Caleb and Margaret. Their reputation as hardworking, trustworthy, and capable ranchers grew, and people began to respect their partnership. Caleb found pride not only in the ranch but also in the recognition that came from the community, while Margaret felt a deep sense of belonging and purpose she had never experienced before. One evening, as the sun set in brilliant colors over the horizon, Caleb and Margaret sat on the porch, reflecting on the past months. "We've done a lot together," Caleb said, sipping his tea. "More than I ever imagined at this age." They had learned that life on the ranch was unpredictable, filled with work, surprises, and sometimes danger, but also filled with beauty, satisfaction, and joy. As summer continued, they began to make plans for the future. Caleb spoke of planting more trees to provide shade for the animals, expanding the pastures, and improving water access across the ranch. Margaret suggested ways to make the land more sustainable, conserving resources and protecting wildlife. Their plans reflected both experience and innovation, blending traditional ranching knowledge with new ideas. Through all of these activities, Caleb and Margaret discovered that life was not just about surviving or maintaining the ranch. It was about thriving, growing, and finding meaning in the work they did together. Their bond was a testament to the power of friendship, trust, and shared purpose. One particularly quiet evening, after a long day of work, they sat under the stars. The night was warm and the air was filled with the sounds of crickets and distant owls. Caleb looked at Margaret, her tall figure silhouetted against the night sky, and felt a deep sense of gratitude. "I never expected life to be like this at my age," he said quietly, "but I'm glad it is." "Life has a way of surprising us," she replied. "Sometimes in the hardest work we find the greatest rewards." Caleb and Margaret had faced challenges that tested their skills, endurance, and patience, yet they had overcome them together. Their bond had grown stronger, rooted in trust, respect, and shared purpose. The ranch stood as a symbol of what could be achieved through teamwork, understanding, and perseverance. And as summer continued, Caleb and Margaret knew that whatever challenges the future held, whether from nature, animals, or unexpected events, they would face them together, stronger for the experiences they had shared and the friendship they had built. Autumn had arrived at the Harper Ranch, painting the fields in shades of gold, amber, and rust. The air was cooler, carrying the scent of dry leaves and distant wood smoke. Caleb Harper, 70 years old and still energetic, walked through the pastures with steady determination. Margaret, his tall and steadfast companion, followed closely, her presence a comfort and support. Life on the ranch had changed over the past months, filled with challenges, victories, and lessons that had strengthened their bond. The harvest season was underway, and Caleb and Margaret spent long hours preparing the fields and collecting crops. The days were shorter than in summer, but the work remained demanding. Caleb had grown accustomed to Margaret's steady presence, and together they moved through the tasks with ease, each knowing what the other would do before it needed to be done. One morning, as they were inspecting the barn, Caleb noticed that one of the hay bales had shifted dangerously close to the edge of a stack. It could easily fall and cause damage or injury. Margaret saw it at the same time. With careful coordination, they moved the bale into a safe position, laughing at their own cautiousness. "We're getting old, but at least we're careful," Caleb said, wiping sweat from his brow. Margaret smiled. "Careful and smart, that counts for something." They repaired fences weakened by summer storms, checked the water troughs, and ensured that the cattle had enough to eat as the season changed. Even minor problems became opportunities for them to work together, to plan and solve issues with patience and skill. Every challenge reinforced the trust and understanding that had grown between them. One afternoon, Caleb received a letter from the local community center, inviting him and Margaret to a small harvest festival. They were to be honored for their contributions to the ranching community and the help they had offered neighbors throughout the year. Caleb hesitated at first, unsure about public attention, but Margaret encouraged him. "It's a chance to celebrate our work and meet others who appreciate it," she said. The festival was a warm and lively event. Neighbors and townspeople gathered, bringing food, music, and laughter. When Caleb and Margaret were recognized, they felt a mixture of pride and humility. People spoke of their hard work, their dedication to the land, and the bond they shared. Caleb glanced at Margaret, smiling quietly, and she returned the look with a gentle nod. The recognition meant little compared to the life they had built together, but it was a reminder of the respect they had earned through diligence and kindness. After the festival, they returned to the ranch, where autumn had begun to settle fully. Leaves rustled underfoot, and the animals moved through the pastures with calm contentment. Margaret suggested planting more trees along the creek to provide shade and prevent erosion during the winter rains. Caleb agreed, appreciating her thoughtful planning. They spent days digging, planting, and securing young saplings, knowing that their efforts would benefit the ranch for years to come. One morning, a sudden cold front arrived, bringing wind and light rain. Caleb and Margaret worked quickly to secure the barn and protect the animals. The cattle huddled together for warmth, and the barn's sturdy construction, reinforced over the past months, held strong against the elements. Margaret suggested adding extra bedding for the livestock, and Caleb helped, arranging hay and straw to provide comfort. Their efforts ensured that the ranch remained safe and thriving despite the changing weather. As the season progressed, Caleb and Margaret reflected on how much the ranch had transformed since they began working together. The land was healthier, the buildings stronger, and the animals well cared for. More importantly, their friendship had deepened into a partnership built on trust, respect, and shared purpose. They had faced storms, fires, droughts, and mechanical failures, yet each challenge had made them stronger and more capable. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills, they sat on the porch, sipping warm tea. The sky was painted in soft pinks and purples, and the air was filled with the quiet sounds of nature. Caleb turned to Margaret. "I never imagined life could feel this full at my age," he said quietly. Margaret smiled. "Life has a way of surprising us, Caleb. We've built something together, something that will last beyond any season." The ranch was no longer just a place to work. It was a living testament to what could be achieved through teamwork, patience, and dedication. As the days grew shorter and the nights cooler, Caleb and Margaret continued their work, preparing the ranch for the coming winter. They repaired fences, ensured the water supply was secure, and gathered extra hay for the animals. Every task was completed with care, a reflection of their commitment to the land and to each other. One afternoon, while walking along the creek, they discovered a small family of deer taking shelter among the trees. Margaret suggested leaving some extra space and providing water nearby, ensuring that the wildlife could coexist with the ranch's animals safely. Caleb agreed, appreciating her thoughtful approach. They spent the afternoon observing the deer, quietly enjoying the beauty of the land and the balance they had helped create. Neighbors continued to visit occasionally, bringing news, advice, and supplies. Caleb and Margaret offered help in return, sharing their experience and skills with others in the community. Their reputation as dependable, knowledgeable, and kind ranchers had grown, and people respected the way they worked together. Caleb felt a sense of pride in what they had achieved, not just for themselves, but for the positive impact they had on those around them. As winter approached, the ranch took on a new rhythm. Mornings were crisp and clear, and the animals moved slowly, conserving energy. Caleb and Margaret adjusted their routines, focusing on tasks that would protect the land and livestock during the colder months. They stocked firewood, reinforced the barn, and ensured that the animals had adequate shelter. Their teamwork continued to be essential, and they relied on each other's strengths more than ever. One particularly cold evening, as snow began to fall lightly across the fields, Caleb and Margaret sat by the fireplace inside the barn. The warmth of the fire contrasted with the chill outside, and the animals rested peacefully nearby. Caleb looked at Margaret, reflecting on the journey they had shared. "I never thought I'd find such companionship at this stage in life," he said softly. Margaret smiled, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "And I never thought I'd find a place where I truly belong. This ranch and the life we've built here is more than I ever imagined." They had faced countless challenges together: storms, droughts, mechanical failures, and threats to the animals. But each difficulty had strengthened their connection. They had discovered that life's rewards were not measured only in material success, but in the relationships, respect, and purpose they had cultivated. In the final days of autumn, Caleb and Margaret prepared the ranch for the coming winter. The land was secure, the animals well cared for, and the buildings sturdy and safe. They worked together to ensure that every detail was addressed, knowing that the effort would protect the ranch and its inhabitants through the cold months. Their teamwork was seamless, a testament to months of shared labor and understanding. One evening, as the first frost coated the fields, Caleb and Margaret stood together on the porch, looking out over the land. The sun was setting, casting long shadows and painting the world in soft gold. "We've done well," Caleb said quietly. Margaret nodded. "Yes, we have. And the best part is, we did it together." Their bond had carried them through every difficulty, and their shared efforts had left the ranch stronger than ever before. As the stars appeared in the clear autumn sky, Caleb and Margaret felt a sense of peace and fulfillment. They had built a life together, rooted in trust, respect, and shared purpose. The ranch was safe, the animals cared for, and their friendship had grown into a lasting partnership. Whatever challenges the future might bring, They knew they would face them together, stronger for the experiences they had shared and the life they had created. The Harper Ranch stood as a testament to the power of teamwork, resilience, and connection. Caleb and Margaret had proven that age, differences, and obstacles could never prevent two people from achieving great things when they worked together. Their story was one of hope, determination, and the enduring strength of friendship, a story that would continue to grow with every season, every challenge, and every moment shared on the land they loved. And as winter approached, with snow beginning to blanket the fields and frost glinting on the fences, Caleb and Margaret sat together in quiet contentment, knowing that the ranch, their partnership, and the life they had built were stronger than ever. They had faced storms and challenges, learned from each other, and created a life full of purpose and fulfillment. Their journey was complete for now, but the story of the Harper Ranch, and the bond between the rancher and his companion, would continue for many seasons to come.